Hey adventurers, so today is going to be a little bit different of a video. I don't usually do response videos, but I like doing them occasionally when there's a topic that I specifically want to talk more about or specifically have some thoughts about. And in this case, I have some thoughts about this. This is a response video to Tori Talks video. Are the first books in fantasy series actually awful? And in this video, she asserts several different things, and her reason for doing this video is primarily that she has been seeing a lot of reviews of first books in series that say things like, well, this is just a setup book, this is mostly a setup book, or something along those lines. And she wanted to push back against that a little bit and say, well, it's epic fantasy. If it's the first book in a series and it's not setting up things, then how are you going to have an epic fantasy series? And that sort of thing. Basically, that with an epic fantasy series, you have to have some setup before you can get into the series and into the payoff and all that kind of stuff. And so I wrote a couple notes or kind of points that she talked about, and I'll kind of go through them. I think I have some discussion for each of these, and so I wanted to go through my own thoughts a little bit about this as I can, because I found her video very interesting, but I also found that while yes, I agree with what she's saying, I also have my own opinions that are slightly different maybe than her own, or at least than what she said in this video. So this idea has been going around in my head since I watched that video. It's been about a week since it came out at the time of filming this, so it'll probably be close to 2 weeks by the time you actually watch this, but that's all right. I'm rearranging my videos so that I can stick this one in because I really want to do this video and I really want to talk about this because I find it an interesting discussion. So, okay. Basically, my generic thoughts for this, for everything that goes into this, is even though it may be the first book in a epic fantasy series of however many pages, however many words, however many books, that does not give it an excuse to tell a boring or bad or unengaging story. And that's kind of where I'm coming from at this, with this response to Tori's. Okay, my first note is to respond to her definitions of epic that she gives. Something that is heroic or grand in scale or character. That is what she's talking about. That's her definition of epic, and she asserts that this conversation is mostly for epic fantasy series. And so I'm going to use that same definition, that same idea, and I'm going to use that same understanding that we're talking about epic fantasy series, not your general fantasy, not cozy fantasy, not this, that, or the other, the things that are actually epic fantasy. And so for that, I do have a lot of examples that I'll talk through as I go when I just decide to talk about things and give some examples. I don't know when that will be in the video, but I find it an interesting discussion, and by limiting it to specifically that epic fantasy genre, it helps a lot to be able to simplify our discussion, because if we're just talking about it in broad terms over all of fantasy, that's going to cause some issues, and that's going to make it so broad that we can't have a good discussion in many ways. And so limiting it to this epic fantasy, which even still is a massive genre, massive subgenre, it helps a lot to have a good discussion about this. So I want to go over this as we go. So that's her definitions. I like that definition. That's basically my own definition for epic fantasy as well. Something that's huge in scale or character, not merely in terms of book count, because or word count or page count or anything like that, because one of the most epic of epic fantasy series and the granddaddy of all epic fantasy is The Lord of the Rings. It's 3 volumes, it's less than 1,000 pages, but it is still epic fantasy at its finest. So yeah, that's the definition is huge in size, scale, grand terms of characters, all that kind of stuff. Not just, oh, it's got lots of books or lots of pages, lots of word count. That's not what defines epic fantasy, because there's some series that have a lot of books, that have a lot of words, that aren't really epic fantasy. And I think one of them I may even talk about in this video. So let's continue. So she talks about how sometimes in book ones there's no satisfying conclusion, and that is, she thinks, what people are complaining about when they say that, oh, this is really more of a setup book, is that there's no satisfying conclusion to the story. And for one thing, I agree with her. That's kind of to be expected if it's the first book in a 14-book series. But at the same time, this goes back to my overarching thoughts on everything. You have to tell a good story. You have to tell a good story first and foremost. Your first book has to tell its own story. It's great to have setup. It's great to have this be one little piece in the larger puzzle. But it has to tell its own story as well, or else why are you having 3 different books when your first book doesn't even tell its own story? Why are you splitting the story if your story does not have a beginning, a middle, and an end, a conclusion to its own story? And so that's what I'm talking about. That's where I come into this from. Yes, they're not going to have the same level of conclusion as the final book in the series, but if they don't have some sort of conclusion for some sort of story that they are telling within that singular book, that is also not good either. She purposefully uses Stormlight and Greenbone Saga as examples of how the first book in the series, you can't expect it to have the satisfying conclusions because it's the first book in a massive series, and she's being facetious on purpose with these examples because we know Stormlight Archive is massive. Each book is well over 1,000 pages. Greenbone Saga 2 is just a massive series, significantly less so than Stormlight, but it's still a huge series, and I'll talk more about those. I haven't read Greenbone, so I won't be using that as an example, but I have read Stormlight, and so I'll use that as an example when I get to it. But with her being facetious about this and saying, well, of course we're not going to have the conclusion, even still, I guarantee, I haven't read Greenbone, so I can't say for certain, but I'm pretty sure that book 1 has a satisfying conclusion for the story that it's telling. It's not the conclusion to the whole story, but it's the conclusion to its own story that it's telling. And I know the first fact that is the case with Stormlight Archive. It's a smaller conclusion. It doesn't fix all the problems that are going on. It doesn't answer all the questions. It doesn't give you all the answers to every single thing, but it concludes the story of Kaladin leading Bridge 4. It concludes that story to a point where we can set it aside and say that was a good story. And if I couldn't do that, Stormlight Archive book 1, the Way of Kings, would not even remotely be close to one of my favorite fantasy books, because it wouldn't have any sort of conclusion. It wouldn't be telling its own story, and it wouldn't be telling a good story because you would be missing a major important piece of that story. And that's the same thing that I assume happens with Greenbone Saga, even though I haven't read it. And so, yeah, everything once again comes back to it has to tell its own story. It has to tell a good story within itself, even if it is still in a setup book. She also mentions that some of her issue may just come from the wording of these reviews and the entitlement that people write these reviews with. Their desire, our current culture wants all this instant gratification and wants this payoff right away and all that kind of stuff. And that's an understandable take to have, being frustrated with just the way that people are wording things and just the fact that they're not being patient. That's understandable. But at the same time, if they are reading series that the first book doesn't have any sort of payoff because it's not telling a complete story in and of itself, that's also an issue. And so if that's where the writers of these reviews are coming from, then it's understandable why they would say this is just a setup book. There's nothing that happens here. Whereas you can look at books like Stormlight Archive, like The Way of Kings, that yes, it is a setup book. It's the first book in a 10-book epic fantasy series. It's the first book of the first arc of Stormlight, which is 5 books. It tells a very specific story, very small scale story, very personal story, while at the same time being massive, epic in scale. And so it can't do all of the things. It can't wrap it up that way, but it does have its own conclusion. And that's an important thing to pay attention to. Of course, we're not going to get the instant gratification. We're not going to get the instant payoff of the Stormlight Archive, but we should hopefully get the payoff and the gratification of the end of The Way of Kings. She also mentions the fact that if you do want that epic fantasy, or if you do want that instant gratification, that payoff immediate, that huge, everything comes together at the end of the story, maybe epic fantasy is not for you. And if that's what you desire, okay, that's fine, that's understandable. You're welcome to have that issue with epic fantasy. If you don't want to wait 14 books of Wheel of Time to get the conclusion, then that's understandable. You don't have to. You can, if you don't want to read it, if you get through the first book and you say, yeah, this is just not for me, I need something a little bit shorter, a little bit more quicker, perfectly acceptable. You're allowed to have your own tastes when it comes to reading books. And so her assertion is that maybe epic fantasy is not right for you if you're wanting the conclusion in book 1. That's fine. That's perfectly acceptable opinion to have. But she also asserts that maybe when we go into epic fantasy, we need to shift our expectations a little bit. We need to allow the payoff to build. We need to expect that the massive explosion of payoff isn't going to happen at the end of book 1, and that you need to spend the time with the series to get to that point where then the epic payoff can happen, and you can be like, I understand. I know why I waited 14 books to get to the end of Wheel of Time so that I could see this payoff. I haven't finished Wheel of Time yet, so I don't know what I'm talking about. But this is the idea where maybe if you're going into epic fantasy, you need to shift your expectations a little bit. Not only say, if book 1 doesn't have any resolution, then I'm not going to continue on with the series. Maybe you need to shift your expectations to say, okay, I'm going to allow the payoff to build. I'm going to allow these individual parts of this greater story to tell their own stories and be content with what they're doing in each one of the individual books. And then as we continue down the line, we'll get to the end. We'll get closer and closer to the end. We'll see all these threads coming together. We'll see the payoff building and building and building and building until suddenly it happens. Everything comes together. We have that Sanderlanche, as it's called for Sanderson's books. And everything just comes together, ties it up in a nice, neat bow, and we understand why we waited that long for that series. And we appreciate that, having waited that long for this payoff, for this conclusion, because we did spend the time with this series. And sometimes, I would even say oftentimes, you need that time, the author needs that time to tell the story that he's trying to tell, that he or she is trying to tell, in order to get to that point where we can then have that payoff. The problem is that we are expecting something that they're not. We're expecting to get all that payoff in book 1, and if we don't, then we're disappointed. But that's because our expectations are wrong for the genre that we are trying to read in. We're not giving them the time and the weight that they need in order to tell that story, to tell that complete story, tell it completely the way that the author wants to tell it. And I understand this. This is something that I fully agree with Tori on. When we go into epic fantasy, we need to adjust our expectations. It's not going to be fast, punchy, action, climax, boom, done. There's going to be moments that feel like they drag a little bit, that feel a little bit slower, that give us time to breathe, that give us time to appreciate the world, understand the world better, to learn the world. And that's the whole point of epic fantasy, and so often is that it's not just, okay, we're going to tell this quick story, because you could tell the entirety of the story of Wheel of Time, or the entirety of the story of Harry Potter, or the entirety of the story of any of these series in a single volume. It would just leave out so much detail and so much character development, and you would miss things, and you would have to write the story very differently in order to tell that entire story in such a short amount of words and a page count and all that kind of stuff. And because of that, sometimes a story, if you want the specific type of emotional payoff that you're getting, you want it to be longer. You need it to be longer. The author needs to take their time with this series in order to tell the story that they are trying to tell. She says that sometimes it can be hard for us to settle in and let go and just allow ourselves to be carried away by a story we're going to spend so much time in. And I agree. Sometimes we start a book and we say, oh, this is not working for me. This is just dragging. This is so boring. I just need something to happen. And sometimes you just need to read the next chapter. Sometimes, okay, for example, I was stuck on book 4 of Wheel of Time for very close to a year, and I was at 29%, and I just physically could not read anymore. And I would think, do I want to read this book? No, I don't want to read this book. I have no desire to read it. And I didn't want to pick it up, and I was at that 29%. I was like, okay, I just need to push through. So I got the audiobook, even though I didn't want to read the series on audio. I wanted to read it physically because I love physically reading epic fantasy series. And so I wanted to push through that just book 4 so that I could then get back into my interest. And hopefully if book 4 didn't work on audio, then I was just going to give up because there was nothing for me there. And what happened is I was at 29% when I started the audiobook. At 33%, it got interesting. I got interested in the story again. That's sometimes what has to happen. Sometimes you're in a building stage of the story and you need to push through just a little bit further into the story before you can get interested in the story. Sometimes it's not worth the time. I fully admit that. I'm not a DNFer. I rarely DNF books. I've done it less than a handful of times. I can think of, off the top of my head, I can think of one book, but there may have been others that I have actually DNF'd without the intent of ever coming back to it. There have been series. I've DNF'd Dresden Files. I don't think I'm going to come back to Dresden Files at this point. Dark Tower, I haven't decided yet. But so I'll DNF series, but usually at the end of a book, not in the middle of a book or anything. Anyways, all that is to say that sometimes you need to get to that 33%, which obviously is mathematically the 1/3, or 33.333333 is 1/3. Sometimes you need to push past 29 and get to 33 in order for the story to become interesting. And that's all I'm saying with that. But basically, sometimes it can be hard for us to allow ourselves to settle in and just let go and allow the story to do what it wants to do with us. And we need to be willing, if we are going to read epic fantasy, we need to be willing to do that. We need to be willing to let go and to wait and to push through a little bit further. Even if you're not interested in book 1 so much, you need to just take a step back and say, okay, I'm going to see what happens here. And we need to make sure that as we are going into an epic fantasy series, and this was one of her assertions as well, that I agree with, we need to make sure that we are not expecting a conclusion for the epic fantasy series at the end of book 1, because you're not going to get it. And if you're expecting it, you're going to be disappointed. Expect a conclusion. If there's not a conclusion at all, if there's not a conclusion to the story that's being told at all, then it would be better if the story did not exist, because it's not a complete story. The book needs to not be split into 14 books. It needs to be cut down into 3 or something along those lines, where you can have conclusions at the end of each book, where you can tell a complete story arc in each individual book while having a complete story arc in the series as a whole. And that's kind of my assertion. I have all of these epic fantasy series that I could start listing and naming and talking about, but I kind of think that does enough, that my thoughts are out there now. And basically, I'll go back to my original thought for this video, and that is that just because it's a setup book does not mean that it's an excuse not to tell a good story or an engaging story in book 1. It's great to have setup books. I've talked about that myself, where I can very clearly see, oh, this book is a setup book. Even sometimes it's in the middle of a series, sometimes it's not at the beginning of a series, sometimes it is book 1. But oftentimes, well, we'll take, for example, The Way of Kings. That is very much a setup book. It sets up the world, it sets up the characters, it sets up the cast that you're going to be seeing, that you're going to be spending time with. It sets up the political climate of the world. It sets up it hints at the greater storyline that's happening, but it is not the story of the Stormlight Archive. The Stormlight Archive is not told in The Way of Kings. The story of The Way of Kings is the story of The Way of Kings. It is the story of Kaladin's journey from a surgeon's assistant to a soldier on the battlefield, to a slave, to a soldier on the battlefield, or to a leader. And it tells his journey. And you get to the end of that book and you say, this is a satisfying conclusion for The Way of Kings. If you were to get to the end of that book and say, this is not a satisfying conclusion for the Stormlight Archive, of course not. It is not the end of the Stormlight Archive. So yeah, that's my thoughts. Yeah, basically that's all I'm saying, is that yes, just when you just say, oh, this is a setup book, that detracts from the story itself. But also, if there is no story besides it being a setup book, that is not a good thing either. So that is my thoughts. I'm going to leave it there. I'm not going to continue. I've rambled enough as this is. but I do appreciate Tori starting this conversation, and I hope that I was able to add something to it, maybe a little bit different than what she said, maybe a little bit to come at it from a little bit different angle. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. Please, if you haven't already, go watch Tori's original video, because having that context, and then you'll hopefully be able to understand where I'm coming at a little bit better with the context of Tori's video. Anyways, thank you guys for watching an Erudite adventure. We will see you guys again soon. Stay well.